appreciate that. My name is Chris Sable, and I'm the Executive Director for the Vail Symposium. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here. I've just got a little bit of housekeeping before we get on to the program. So I'd like to ask everybody, if you've got a cell phone, just put it into silent. You don't want to be the one cell phone that goes off in the middle of the program and everybody looks at you, so thanks for that. Also, I always ask, if you're a Facebook fan, we also have a Facebook page, and we would love it if you would friend us, and if you enjoy the program tonight, or if you have a comment about it, we'd love for you to go on and make a comment. It's one of the great ways for us to spread the word and to try to grow our audience. So if you could help us with that, we would certainly appreciate that. We've got an added event that is not in the brochure that I want to tell you about, and I hope that you'll all be able to join us. On April 6th, we've added a program with Jeff Tabin and Timmy O'Neill. And Jeff Tabin is the foremost ophthalmologist in America, but with his partner Sanduk Ruet, started the Himalayan Cataract Project. And their mission is to eradicate curable blindness in their lifetime. And they have done an amazing job in Nepal and Tibet and in China and Bhutan and India. They've since opened clinics in Rwanda, I believe in Ethiopia, and they just keep training more doctors to do this, and it's an amazing thing that they're doing. Jeff is also a world-class climber. He was a part of the team to make it up the last unclimbed face, summit of Everest. He was also part of the team that got the first woman to the summit Everest, and Timmy O'Neill is another amazing climber. So it's going to be a program about the Cataract Project, but also about their climbing and a lot of great things, and he's an amazing, amazing presenter. That's going to be at the Villar Center. And then next week, this was also an added program, but it's next week on Tuesday night. The program is called No Barriers, and it's with Eric Weinmeier. And Eric is the blind climber to Summit Everest, the first and only, I believe, blind climber to Summit Everest. But he's going to tell his story since Everest, from leading expeditions around the world with blind Tibetan teenagers to helping injured soldiers climb their way home from war, adopting a son from Nepal, and finally, a year and a half ago, he solo kayaked the Grand Canyon, and he has a new book coming out about that, which we'll have here, and you get a chance to meet him. So that's going to be a great program. I want to thank a few people that make this possible, certainly all of you for attending, but tickets cover about 18% of our budget, and so we're really indebted to our donors and our sponsors, and I want to thank a few of them. I certainly want to thank all of our donors. Every gift makes a difference to us, no matter what size. So if you've been thinking, I don't think I can make a difference, you can make a difference. We'd love for you to join our donor family. I want to thank the Donovan Pavilion, the Town of Vail, the Vail Daily, Vail Resorts, Epic Promise, Alpine Bank, the Antlers at Vail, and the underwriters for tonight's program are Holly and Buck Elliott. Could we give all of them a big round of applause? This is going to be an amazing program. We've got three incredible panelists here, and our moderator tonight is Karen Newell, and she'll introduce each of the panelists as they speak, so she'll take charge of that. Karen is the co-founder of Sacred Acoustics. She just co-authored Eben's third book, which will be coming out in October, and they travel around the world doing workshops, teaching people how to get into an expanded state of awareness. And so, again, thank you so much for coming. Be very careful going home tonight. We hope to see you again at another program. Karen, where are you? Karen, thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good to see you all. This is the third time I've been here with Eben presenting to you, and I think Eben was here a year before that, and Eben always enjoys the skiing while I stay in the room and work. So you can tell his face is very red from the skiing. Anyway, tonight is really exciting because we have three doctors who are going to share their insights on near-death experience. Something that happened just this year is a new book came out. We don't have it here, but it's available at your local bookworm store. And this is a book called The Science of Near-Death Experience. And it's a series of articles written by doctors, nurses, and researchers, anyone in the medical field, And these articles all appeared in a medical journal called Missouri Medicine, and all of them have now been put together in a book called The Science of Near-Death Experience, of which both Raymond and Eben were contributors to. So if you're interested in the doctor's perspective on this issue, look out for that book. Now, what's really interesting to me is doctors are kind of at the front line of those near-death experiences because they're the ones who hear from their patients. Now, I was reminded before the program that it's actually these days the nurses that are at the real front line, and the doctors prefer to kind of hang back and not be around and hear those things. But quite interestingly, it's doctors who have come up with new ways to resuscitate people and are actually increasing how many people actually have near-death experiences. So it's quite ironic and somewhat satisfying when doctors themselves have a near-death experience. And of course, that brings a whole other level of transformation in their personal lives and also how they address their patients and how their attitudes change. And it's really a wonderful thing that people like Mary and Eben and of course Raymond, who is not quite a practicing physician, but we'll get to him in a second. But it's really wonderful how people like them, when their attitudes change, how they make patients feel much more comfortable about these very common experiences. And so we're going to talk about the medical aspect of these experiences tonight. And Dr. Eben Alexander, who many of you already know, had a near-death experience in November of 2008. He had a severe case of bacterial meningitis that shut down his neocortex, and of course he had this amazing experience that did not at all fit the model of scientific theory that the brain creates consciousness, and this transformed his complete worldview. And so tonight he will take a few minutes to share with us, just kind of remind us, and if you haven't heard his story, the medical aspects of the experience that he underwent. So, Eben.
Yes, welcome. Great to be back again. I love Vail, I love the people here, and love the skiing. But getting back to my experience, and many of you have heard this story, but I had spent 20 plus years as a neurosurgeon, 15 years at Harvard Medical School, thought I had some idea of how brain, mind, and consciousness work. And I bought into the conventional neuroscientific assumption that the physical brain creates consciousness out of pure physical matter, that there's nothing else to the picture. Now, I did have religious beliefs that growing up in a Christian Methodist home, wanting to kind of see an afterlife and all that, but my medical teaching and my medical experience did not really support that, and I bought into that kind of brain creates consciousness. And that's why when in November 2008, I very suddenly developed a severe case of bacterial meningitis that drove me into coma within 3.5 hours and left me in coma for 7 days. This changed everything for me. Now, it was such a devastating illness. Those in medicine realize that when you hear about say my MRI scan, CT scan showing full thickness destruction of my neocortex over all 8 lobes of my brain, and my neurologic exams that showed that the last vestige of any kind of natural reflex of my neocortex was gone by the first hour or so of my being in the emergency room, and then spending the next week in coma due to this illness. And most doctors who take care of such patients will tell you that if a patient has gram-negative bacterial meningitis, goes into coma, within a few hours, they've got at best a 10% chance of survival, which is what they estimated for me. By the end of the week, when they were seeing no signs of any turnaround, I'd been on 3 powerful intravenous antibiotics the whole week, and that's when they held the family conference and said, well, he's down to a 2% chance of survival, and best case scenario, if he's in that 2%, is to spend a month or 2 in the hospital, then transfer to a nursing home, where I would then succumb to the illness finally and die months later, never recovering. So it was such a severe case that there was no prediction for any kind of recovery. And of course, that has been a tremendous shock. Now, when I did come back to this world on that day 7 of coma, I had no memories of Eben Alexander's life. It was all gone, every bit of it. In fact, words and language gone. My sons, my sisters, my mother standing at the bedside, I had no idea who these beings were. My brain was wrecked, but it came back very rapidly. That's the part that was so shocking. Words and language came back over hours. Childhood memories returned basically over a week or two. All of my semantic knowledge, all of those 20 years spent in neurosurgery, all my knowledge of physics, chemistry, biology, returned completely within about 2 months. And in fact, the odd thing of it all, the oddest thing, is I came to recognize through various conversations over the next few years that the memories were more complete than they had been before my coma. One of the biggest problems with our materialist thinking about the brain and consciousness is we've never been able to find any site in the brain where memories seem to reside. And of course, that becomes much more difficult when you start realizing that things like telepathy, precognition, presentiment, a lot of non-local consciousness examples are very present in this world. And to address consciousness, we need to address all that. It includes things like past life memories in children, indicative of reincarnation. So if you're going to be talking about memory and consciousness, you need to include this much bigger theater of operations. And that's basically what my journey has been about. My personal experience showed me the brain does not create consciousness. In fact, the shocker was the more destroyed my neocortex, the more liberated I was. But that kind of thing has been very much supported with recent work, more and more evidence in the medical world that consciousness is not created by the brain at all. In fact, the best way to look at it is consciousness is fundamental. The brain is a filter that allows in primordial consciousness. And that's why things like past life memories and reincarnation can start to make sense. But of course, it opens up a much bigger theater of understanding that we're trying to explain. And I think that's why having this kind of panel is very interesting, because it shows that the medical scientific position is shifting rapidly to something that fully supports the reality of the afterlife, of concepts such as reincarnation, and that we are far, far more than just a little physical body that exists birth to death and nothing more. We're all part of one mind, of one consciousness, of one infinite power, and that is what we're coming to learn now. And it empowers each and every one of us individually. So that is probably the greatest gift of it all. I think in a nutshell, that kind of covers the medical details.
All right. Thank you, Eben. I didn't even have to...
Thank you.
I didn't even have to give him my stop signal. Very good. All right, so Mary Neal, Dr. Mary Neal is an orthopedic spine surgeon. She was the former director of spine surgery at USC, and she lives in Jackson Hole, Wyoming right now. Also an avid skier, but is not able to ski because of a very slight knee injury this week. But also she has a little trouble with her voice, so forgive her. She has a little cold. But at any rate, in 1999, she was shocked one day when she was down in Chile kayaking in a very remote location and had a drowning incident. Now tomorrow she's going to tell the very full version of her story, which is quite fascinating. But tonight, and her experience is all written up in the book To Heaven and Back. But tonight, just briefly, she's going to share with us, again, like Eben did, more the medical aspects of her experience in a brief summary. Mary?
Thank you very much. So I'm going to do this the best I can. My husband was trying to convince me that this voice was really appealing, but I don't think so. He's a good man. But yes, I will tell you, and I'm not going to have nearly enough time to actually tell you, quote, my story, but I will start off by telling you that I think Eben and I are probably very similar in that I grew up in a church in the Midwest. I grew up going to Sunday school, but never was I ever expected or even considered the idea that there was actually more to it than just going to church. I never really thought about the consciousness. I never really thought about truly the spiritual life. It was sort of going through the motions. And then I went off to college and medical school and absolutely, like Eben, subscribed to the religion of the intellect. And I was a scientist, and I believed that science really was preeminent. And have to say that I think, like many people, really never had the time to think about it. Never really thought about spirituality as something other than what other people do. I was very busy with medical school and residency, and then I finished. I took over as director of spine surgery, and then had a kid and another, and they kind of kept coming, and then we figured out how to make that stop. So, but the point is, I think that I was very, very typical of most people, not even just most physicians, in that spirituality and the big questions of life were something that I really didn't have time to do. And really never gave it a lot of thought, although I will say that over the years there were intermittent patients who would sort of shock me. I was taking care of a liver transplant patient one time and had really developed a pretty close relationship with her. She was a young gal, and back in those days with liver transplants, people went to the operating room again and again and again. And on one of her trips back, she pulled me aside and said, I'm not coming back this time. And I mean, I was a young surgeon. I wasn't really willing to accept that as a comment. So I sort of said, well, I don't think so. I mean, we're going to do a good job. We'll get you back. And she said, no, you just don't get it, do you? I said, well, no, I know that we'll get you back. Don't worry about it. She said, no, I've been talking to the angels all day, and I'm not coming back this time. And I want you to tell my parents that it's okay. That sort of shook me up a little bit. And so there were intermittent glimpses, but of course, I was able to quickly kind of put that aside. Not that I didn't believe her, but I just really didn't have time for it. And then I went to Chile in 1999. And my husband and I are avid kayakers. We were there for his birthday. Our youngest child was old enough that I thought we could leave. And of course, that was a watershed moment. And we went down and had a great time. And then we started to paddle on a river that's well known for its waterfalls. And he actually didn't paddle with us that day, but we went over the first waterfall, and that was fine. Second one, that was fine. So we came to this one particular waterfall and had decided to run this smaller chute, and I took off, and this other person sort of lodged their boat sideways. And so I didn't have any other option. This is a very high flow, high velocity river, and so I went over the main part of the waterfall and hit the bottom and stuck. That was that. And the boat was pinned in the rocks underneath, and I was immediately submerged under 8 or 10 feet of water. And I'm a very calm, even-keeled person, so I said, okay, this isn't so good. And tried to free the boat, tried to free myself, and nothing worked. And I'm very pragmatic. I realized, okay, time was ticking off. I know what happens to the anoxic brain, and without oxygen, things start to shut down very quickly. Without oxygen, it's a long, they would take more than 10 minutes to go into it, but basically, your brain cells start dying. And one of the things that's interesting is that the most sensitive tissue is something called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus happens to be the part of the brain that is most responsible for the creation of new memories. And that becomes important because people would like to say that the anoxic brain, on one hand, can't function, and on the other, is responsible for creating these memories. So it was interesting. Anyway, I was underneath, and I said, well, okay. I started calmly praying, and I didn't pray, gee, please come and get me out of this mess. But I really asked that God's will be done, and at that point I was overcome with a very physical sensation of being held and comforted and reassured, and then we went through a life review, and I have to say, going back to this idea that I didn't have time to think about a spiritual life, I had never really thought about my own death. We all have been around death plenty of times in our medical training and our practice, but dealing with someone else's death is very different than dealing with your own. And I really didn't have any preconceptions. But we went through this life review, and that was the first very profound aspect of my experience, because it had nothing to do with judgment. It had nothing to do with feeling bad or guilty or, gee, I could have done that better. It was everything having to do with grace, everything having to do with God's absolute love for us and the fact that we really are representative of love. And we have this incredible ability to show grace to other people. And during this life review, I had this incredible opportunity of re-experiencing every event that we looked at and re-experiencing it from not only everyone's perspective, but really understanding their backstory, understanding what brought each person to that particular moment in time, understanding their hurts, their joys, their suffering. And with that understanding came the ability to not just forgive people, because that's only one aspect of it, but really understand grace. And it radically changed my experience of people since then. And I certainly recognize that I don't know the backstory of anyone, and we all have backstories. We all have, we're all the sum total of our history, and that is what brings us to this moment, and it's what influences our words and our actions. So that was pretty remarkable, and I was still me. I was still very analytical about it all, and my little thought balloon was thinking, wow, is this really happening? This is interesting. I never had panic. I never had a sense of air hunger. I never felt conscious and then unconscious. I just felt conscious and then more conscious. And eventually the current kind of pulled my body out of the boat, and as that happened, my spirit split off from my body, and that again was a very gentle, wonderful thing. And I rose up out of the river and was greeted by this group of people, spirits, beings, I don't know what to call them. They were there to greet me and welcome me and make sure that I felt loved. And I knew that I'd known them as long as I had existed, and I knew that they had known me and loved me as long as I had existed. And I knew that they were there to protect me. I don't know what from. But there was an absolute shift of time and dimension, and they took me down this exquisitely beautiful path that really spoke to me. I was telling Raymond earlier, I absolutely believe that God presents to each one of us at the time of our death the experience that will move us, the experience that will speak to us, that will make us feel and understand how loved we are, that will make us feel welcome, that will make us feel like we're home. And for me, that was these colors and flowers and the aromas. People ask all the time, did you hear music and that kind of thing? And I didn't. I mean, I wouldn't appreciate it if I did. And maybe country western, but that's about it. And there was a shift of dimension such that I could be with them and at the same time see the scene at the river, see them pull my body to the side, see them start CPR. And at that point in time, before they started CPR, I'd been without oxygen for about 30 minutes. And 30 minutes not only yields a basically 0% survivability, but the idea of surviving without severe brain damage is really beyond comprehension. And we didn't have medical care. The guys I was with did CPR, but that was it. I mean, we were in the middle of nowhere. We didn't even have cell phones back then. So while that was all happening, I went on to this sort of great dome structure of sorts, and I won't get into all of that today, but at a certain point, I was told the classic, you got to go back. And I did what I think any reasonable person would do, which is I said, I'm good. I can stay. because I had been reassured earlier by Christ that everything was fine. But here I am, so obviously I got kicked out. But at that point in time, I was told a number of reasons why I had to come back, a number of things that I still had to do. One of which was doing what I don't really want to do, which is sharing my story with other people. And then I was taken back down this path and reunited with my body. And again, for me, it was a very pragmatic sort of thing. I mean, I'm not a fanciful, creative kind of person. I said, okay. I sat in my body and I laid back, and there I was. You know, some people have described difficulty getting into their body. I mean, it was just kind of straightforward. And then there we were, you know, of course, in the middle of nowhere. And then these two people just appeared. Where we were on the river was inaccessible. There were steep hillsides covered in bamboo. And really, my journey back to the U.S. Was nothing short of miraculous. I had multiple broken bones and torn ligaments, and I was in dire straits, to put it mildly. And then en route, I developed a severe case of basically a pulmonary trauma, ARDS, and had oxygen levels in the 40s, which again are kind of not really compatible with survival. And sort of similar to Eben, as far as, you know, physicians telling his family, hey, I'm sorry. When I finally arrived back to the emergency room, they basically said to my husband, I'm sorry, it's over. And so it's a remarkable example of how we don't know everything. And the story goes on beyond that. It took me years to really figure out, okay, what really happened to me. I would tell you that any person, and there are many millions of people in this country alone who have had near-death experiences or profound spiritual experiences, and every one of those people would absolutely tell you that they know what they know. And it's a very different kind of knowing. I knew something profound had happened. But one of the things I'd been told about was the coming death of my oldest son and the expectations for how I was going to respond to that. So when I came back, I was on a mission to disprove what I had just experienced because it was very important to me. If I was to accept my experience as being real and true, then it meant everything I'd been told was real and true. And I had every reason in the world to disprove that. And what's interesting to me is I went about it, again, in a very pragmatic way. I mean, I went about it logically and, quote, scientifically, although there's very little science when it comes to spiritual things. You can't prove spirituality. You can't prove love, even though we all know it exists. But I did collect all the data I could. I collected all of the medical data, and indeed, I mean, I talked to everyone who had been at the river, everyone who was part of the transport, everyone who was in the receiving hospital. And yeah, I really was without any oxygen for 30 minutes, and then, you know, and then no special medical care. I mean, it was, you know, the pumping on your chest sort of thing that you do on a rocky riverbank. But in the end, I decided that my experience was real and true, and then I started learning about near-death experiences and about all sorts of things, you know, the deathbed visits and everything else. And what's interesting to me, because we're here as physicians, is I had never actually heard about them. And I think that's pretty common. Raymond's book came out in 1975, so you would think that I should have heard about something. but I didn't. And I don't know about Evan, but it's just isn't really part of my awareness. And as I started reading about it, it became really of great interest to me to increase the awareness of this kind of experience. Because what's clear and obvious is the greater the awareness is, the freer other people are to talk about it. And I will tell you that I have at this point heard, I don't know, thousands of people's stories. And I believe that is only because I had the courage, and I do think it takes courage to share my experience. I think it takes courage as a physician. But I think actually it takes courage as anyone. Because everyone starts out by saying, you know, I've never told anyone because you fill in the blank. But it all boils down to because I knew people would think I was crazy. And I think it's like anything. As awareness increases, I can guarantee you in this room, there are many, many people who have either had an experience or know someone that had an experience. But I bet most of you probably haven't shared it with anyone. And I would encourage you to share it, because it's surprising to me as a physician how many people now come to see me, we talk about their neck or talk about whatever, and then at the end they say, can I have a couple more minutes? And I just sort of say, yeah, sure. I know what's coming. And then they go on to tell me their story, and it's of such great relief to them. You know, I thanked Raymond earlier for writing his book, and my gratitude is because he actually put words to something that so many people have experienced but didn't know how to explain, didn't even know what it was. Someone came up to Raymond earlier saying, you know, you changed my life. I had this experience as a kid and I didn't even know what it was. And I would say, you're probably the same. Until you experience it, so many of us don't really know it exists. So I'm grateful for this conference and conferences like this and the opportunity to share, because I think that then begets more sharing.
Thank
so
you,
with
Mary.
That, we'll move on.
Thank you. So Dr. Raymond Moody hardly needs an introduction. He wrote the famous book Life After Life in 1975, which kind of opened up this whole phenomenon in the Western world. And we're going to ask him to speak about the phenomenon of shared death experiences or shared near-death experiences that doctors have in the context of there is no medical problem going on, and yet they have similar experiences. So, Raymond?
Yes, well, unlike Mary and Evan, okay. Thanks, Mary. Unlike Mary and Evan, I did not come into this through the world of medicine. I am a medical doctor, psychiatrist, but before I went to medical school, I had gone to the University of Virginia at age 18 to study astronomy, which is still one of my favorite subjects, but I quickly got whisked away into philosophy. And in the first few days as an undergraduate student at UVA, I read Plato's Republic and got hooked, because the Republic ends in an amazing story of a warrior who had been believed dead but revived on the funeral pyre, and related what we have come to know as a near-death experience. I quickly found out from my professor, Professor Hammond, that in fact early Greek philosophers were fascinated by the occasional events in which people apparently returned from a state of death. And as a matter of fact, the standard way we argue about these things or debate about them in the West was set by the early Greek philosophers. If we went back to Athens at the time of Plato, people would have known about this phenomenon, and they argued about it in the same way. Plato listened to these stories, and he took them at face value as indicators of an afterlife. Meanwhile, his rough contemporary, Democritus, approached these stories in a different way, and that was that Democritus had just figured it out by reasoning that contrary to your sense experience, that this tabletop here is an unbroken continuum. Democritus realized that actually it has to be made up of tiny little minute bits that are too small to be seen, which he called atoms. And once they reasoned this out by logical means, they could observe it in the world, because if you have a long-term marriage, gradually your gold wedding ring mysteriously gets thinner, but you never, as long as you stand there, you'll never see a piece of gold drop off of it. So Democritus listened to these stories, and basically his thought was that there's residual biological activity even after apparent death. He famously said there's no such thing as a moment of death. And he argued, as many do today, that these experiences are artifacts of the brain process and the dying brain. Now, that's how I got into this. And then in 1965, as an undergraduate, I met Dr. George Ritchie, who was a professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia, and heard him tell his story. And subsequent to that time, I have, like Mary, just interviewed thousands and thousands of people from all over the world who came to the brink of death and reported these amazing stories. Now, I have never been into the mindset of those who argue about this thing in the customary way, for two reasons. The primary one being, the big problem of existence is consciousness. And getting my PhD in philosophy, and even as an undergraduate philosophy, you learned about the different theories of what is called the mind-body relationship. And in the real world, we just have no idea how the apparent physical substance of the brain is related to the unique individual experience of consciousness. You know, that's the reality. We just don't know. But many people are afraid to say, I don't know. To me, it comes very easily to my lips. But some people want to think they know. And so basically what they do in this philosophical point of view, which is called epiphenomenalism, which is the philosophical position that there is no independent reality to consciousness, but what we experience as consciousness is only an unreal secondary byproduct of what they regard as the primary reality, which is the physical substance of the brain and the electrochemical reactions occurring in it. And you know, that is almost a premise of our society. People don't think through these things before they start studying medicine, usually, because medical training is pretty intense and you don't have a chance to do all these things. But epiphenomenalism is, I think, it's not even false. It's incoherent. We think that we mean something when we say this, but if you really analyze it, the fact is we don't know. We don't know, and that's a comfortable position to me. Now, I didn't have a religious background either, and except for 3 times I went to a Presbyterian church when I was 12, I guess, during my Dad's midlife crisis. He dragged us to church for 3 times, and then he figured this is not for me. And so when I started hearing these near-death experiences, I just didn't know what to make of them. And again, it was in the context of philosophy. My main areas of interest in philosophy are logic and philosophy of language and ancient Greek philosophy. And that is what still I am primarily interested in. And it is in philosophy and not in science that the eventual solution, if there is one, of the afterlife question will come. Because for various reasons, which I won't describe now, it's the notion of a scientific proof of an afterlife. That may sound good to somebody, but it's not even a notion that really makes any sense when you start thinking about it. But the question of an afterlife is still an active philosophical question, and philosophical thinking is conceptual. Okay, so when I got to medical school in 1972, I had already interviewed lots and lots of these people, and it gave me a opportunity to hear these things from patients while they were still in the hospital and so on. My professors at the medical college, by the way, were very sympathetic. A number of them were people who had had such an experience or who had heard these from their patients. So my medical school professors greatly assisted me in this research. Now, at the sort of end of the first quarter at medical school, I was in the bookstore one day and was approached by a woman I did not recognize, but who had recognized me from the pictures of the entering medical school students that everybody gets, and she came up to me and she identified herself as Dr. So-and-so, an eminent professor of medicine there. And she said, Dr. Moody, I've wanted to talk with you and talk with you about an experience that took place to me when I was interviewing my mother. And so she described how when she had walked into a room and saw her mother collapse of a cardiac arrest, and she instituted cardiopulmonary resuscitation. But at the point where she felt her mother die, she herself, this physician, exited her body, saw her mother's now deceased body down below, and saw her own body trying to resuscitate her mother. Became aware, she said, of the presence of her mother there with her, to use her words, now in spirit form, saw apparitions of her mother's deceased relatives and friends emerging from this light, and then she saw her mother recede into this passageway and came back to her body and resumed her life, and greatly changed life, by the way, then. And that was the first instance I'd ever heard of what I've heard now hundreds and hundreds of times, that I call shared death experiences, which are identically the same phenomena that people report to us as near-death experiences, except that they occur not to somebody who almost dies and is revived, but rather to a bystander who is not ill or injured, who is there at the scene where someone else dies. And they talk to us about how when the person in the bed passes away, they themselves may leave their body and accompany their dying loved one part way toward this light. Incidentally, I have a number of cases where the bystander actually empathically co-lived the dying life review of the person who passed away, which to me is a shocking thought, because I'm not even looking forward to sitting in on my own life review. The idea of a spectator there is kind of embarrassing. However, it's really interesting. In all of these cases I've interviewed, people say that we imagine it would be embarrassing, but in reality it's not. The way I think of this in terms of my psychiatric practice is almost everybody's got the same secrets. And I say almost because I was a forensic psychiatrist working in a maximum security unit for the criminally insane with paranoid schizophrenic killers and mass murderers, serial killers, and so on. And maybe some of them did have secrets that most people don't have, obviously. But and the average person. And incidentally, you don't have to be closely connected to the person to have a shared death experience. And indeed, not too long ago, I got a communication from a physician who was called to the ER to resuscitate a patient he had never laid eyes on. But as he was resuscitating this man, he said he was flooded with images all around him that portrayed the life of this person. So we're dealing with something very unusual here, and I understand perfectly why there is resistance about this, because, you know, incredibly to me, I just think so many people, it's astonishing. You know, when they get their PhD or their MD, they want, at that point, knowledge is supposed to stop, right? And to me, there's only one reason why I inquire, and it's not noble at all. It is just that it's so much fun. And if you set out in life to inquire into things by formulating what you want to be and then manufacturing an argument to support that, that's no fun, because that's self-deception. Deep down, we all know when we're deceiving ourselves, so that's why it's a very unstable sort of point of view. I am a skeptic in the genuine rational sense. The average person, the people who use that word, oh, I'm a skeptic about this, it's very interesting to me. I've never met one of them who really understands what the skeptical movement, which was an early Greek philosophical movement, founded by a philosopher named Pyrrho about 20 years after the death of Aristotle. And from the skeptical position, what you really try to do is you try to keep disproving something. Because when you do, if you commit yourself to do a really rational, rigorous argument, and you just try to refute everything you think about, then eventually what comes up on the other side of this is more satisfying. Now, where have I come to this? Well, not having a religious background, I always knew for sure that the people that I talked with who had these experiences were sincere, that they were reporting what they experienced, and it was obvious that it greatly changed their lives. Now, there is a question beyond that, and that is that what is the ultimate nature of these things? And the problem here is not where we normally assume that it is, because the real problem of rational proof of an afterlife was brilliantly stated by the skeptical philosopher David Hume, who lived from 1711 to 1776. And I'll tell you what Hume reported or said about the difficulty of the rational problem of an afterlife. He said, by the mere light of reason, it seems difficult to prove the immortality of the soul. By what arguments or analogies can we prove any state of existence which no one ever saw and which no way resembles any that ever was seen? Some new species of logic is required for that purpose, and some new faculties of the mind, that they may enable us to comprehend that logic. And that is the real issue. In thinking about the afterlife, Plato brilliantly stated the problem a long time ago, and that is, he said, there's always got to be some storyline to it, because the notion of an afterlife is so obscure. You've got to have some sort of narrative or story even to get speculation about it or thinking about it started. And they had the same kinds of narratives that we have today. They just had fewer of them because there was no CPR. But they had the same kind of thing. I got out of my body and went down a passageway and so on. And they saw my life in review. Now, and that is the real problem, that we need a new logic. We can't solve the rational problem of an afterlife with the mind we have and with the code of logic that we have. And that has always been the problem. What I want to say here, and I'm very sorry about this, but my book on this subject has been published in France, but I just can't find an American publisher yet, basically. But what I can tell you is that I have worked out the logic that, among many of its many other implications, does shed a totally new light on the afterlife. And I've been teaching this logic to people. Actually, it's been developed since I was first a philosophy professor in 1969, and I've continued to develop it. But we can actually impart new rational principles to ourselves. And my conjecture for a long time has been that, and have given seminars on this, it's just new rational principles on how to think about things that are not literal. The Aristotelian code of logic is predicated on literal meaning and the true-false distinction. But since sentences like "there is life after death," ultimately, in terms of literal language, are unintelligible, then you have to have additional rational principles that enable you to think logically about things that are unintelligible. And that is what I've worked out now. And I always knew that eventually somebody who had taken this logic course would end up having a near-death experience, and for reasons that I won't relate here because it's complicated, I knew they would be relating it in a wholly different way. And then once you collect a lot of cases, we have a lot of cases of people who've experienced this and relate it through the lens of an Aristotelian logic. Now I think in the not-too-distant future we'll have other accounts that are related through the lens also of these additional principles of logic. And what that gives is what astronomers call parallax. You have two different cases, the standard, then these over here, and that gives you a way of triangulating in on the notion of an afterlife. And I know that's obscure and abstract, but that's the basic principle. And just on October 15th, 2015, it came to pass. A very distinguished artist and physicist who had about 6 or 7 years ago, before had been to one of my seminars, called me, and actually not to think about that specifically, but he had been through just a gosh awful, oh my God, infection. It's a horrific thing. But he survived, and he had 3 near-death experiences during his hospitalization, and that's what he was talking about. But then his voice was very weak because of this ordeal. But then suddenly I heard a shift in the tone of his voice. He said, "And Raymond, when I was on the other side," he said, my mind went back. I thought about the course that we took, and he said, "You were right. I realized then when I was over there," he said, "that in order to understand how this world is connected with that other dimension, you've got to take the unintelligibility axis into account," which is exactly the way I guess a physicist would relate it. And so I know that more of this is coming too. And basically, we've got an entirely new rational means now of investigating this question of an afterlife. And the exciting thing about it is that we do know a means now of reformatting our logical structures and to increase the cognitive capacity of our mind so that we're able to think about these things in a new way. Now, where I have come to this is I have just finally, in the last couple of years, I've had to say, and it's really still hard to get these words out of my mouth because they are still to me very counterintuitive. Okay? But what I'm going to have to say is that, yes, there is an afterlife, which is incredibly surprising to me. But most importantly, because I've developed ways that I can understand how we can think about this logically in a new way. But also because I've just so many incredibly puzzling cases have just really, I've eventually gotten to the point of realizing that it's a much more complicated and thing to not say that. Let me give you an example.
Raymond.
Uh,
Raymond.
Yes?
I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
No
Cool.
example.
No problem.
Did you have something?
Unfortunately, your mic has died, and we don't know if it's coming back.
Just switching the
So
mics.
we're going to do a shared mic experience.
Okay. Awesome.
Can you turn your mic off?
Thank you, Raymond. It was amazing, as always. So I want to address our next question to Eben. And what I think would be really interesting for people to know, because you're not a practicing neurosurgeon now, but you were very often working with terminal patients who were very close to death in your particular practice, operating on, unoperable brain tumors and such. And I'm curious, I know you heard stories like this before your coma, and now if you were back there with a patient, how might you react, the before and after of someone telling you a similar story that we've been hearing?
Well, the before and after is really quite extreme. It's a 180-degree shift. And I did hear stories before my coma, as you pointed out, and one of these I mentioned in Proof of Heaven. But the more I spent time in this in the neurosurgical mindset, the more difficulty I had understanding how any kind of conscious awareness could come from after the death of the brain and body. And I was under that spell of the illusion of people thinking the brain is creating consciousness. And I would say it's shifted entirely because I've now come to realize that consciousness is absolutely fundamental. I mean, what I see in this room are beautiful, basically kind of vortices of energy, of beautiful light that are all part of one mind, one beautiful existent being. And of course, when we die or have a near-death experience, we come much more in touch with that being because we're liberated from the shackles of the physical brain. And that is the evolving model, both in kind of the scientific understanding with the brain looking at what's called filter theory, but it paints this absolutely beautiful picture that empowers us tremendously. And what it emphasizes is the connectedness of us all, that this is not just about humans, it's also about animals and all life on earth, that we are part of this one beautiful existence of mind that is here for us to learn the lessons that we're here to learn. And so it's a whole different mindset, because now I look at things like illness and injury that before my career as a neurosurgeon, of course, those were kind of the enemy. Go up against those. But what I've come to realize is that our lives are so beautiful and perfect in so many ways that those illnesses and injuries and the hardships and hurdles in life should be viewed more as gifts. They're the stepping stones to our growth. So getting a terminal diagnosis or losing a child, these really horrific things that people have to live through are actually their means of growth, of recovering the sense of connection with oneness, with an infinitely loving force. Plus our connection with each other, that we are all in this together. And so these lessons that I see now are really ones where the best way to kind of address them is to recover that love for self. I saw so clearly how the worst problems of this world, in huge number, are really that we don't even love ourselves enough. So it's recovering the divinity within us all, that beautiful, sacred, infinite healing power of love that's inside each and every one of us. So I have a whole different viewpoint now on death and illness and disease. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, with the evolution of our understanding of consciousness, brain, and mind, and especially when you look at the scientific data, for example, out of the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies, where they have more than 2,500 cases from around the world of children with past life memories where the best explanation for the whole situation is true reincarnation. So obviously we're dealing with something much bigger than I used to think was kind of the field of operation of this understanding of brain, mind, and consciousness. And I also have come to realize that whereas most of us kind of buy into what Karen and I, in our next book, which will come out in October, refer to as the supreme illusion, it is so cunning, baffling, and powerful that we kind of lose sight of it. And that is that the brain and mind somehow convince us that all of the out there, the people I see in this room, and then the beautiful mountains and snow and trees and the clouds and the sunset and the stars in the sky at night, what we're experiencing is an internal model. We're not experiencing any of the reality out there. So in fact, this capability of brain and mind is so clever to kind of give us this idea that we exist as a physical being separate, that then there's all the rest of the universe. But in fact, no. In fact, we are all one with this one mind of the universe. And in fact, the best way I can see to explain it all is to follow the lead of those brilliant founding fathers of quantum physics, like Heisenberg and Dirac, de Broglie, and others, who kept telling us over and over again that the results of experiments in quantum physics tell you loud and clear, consciousness is fundamental in the universe. It is not some emergent property of the workings of the brain. And so we're now into a much richer kind of understanding of this. And I think as doctors, as scientists, physicists, others begin to address this much more deeply, it leads to something that is very refreshing and liberating for every soul in this room. Because what it does is it returns free will to you to manifest your will, your destiny, live your dreams, and realize that this really is very much about you. And facing the hardships and difficulties in life is something you can do with love in your heart, because as interconnected sacred beings, all of this under the guise of this beautiful, infinitely loving force that I witnessed in my journey, that so many others in near-death experience and shared death and after-death communications, I mean, they're out there by the hundreds of millions. What it's showing us is we are all part of that one mind. The coin of that realm is love. And the more we can learn to manifest, recover that love for ourselves as divine beings, and the best way to manifest that is to channel it. Bring it in. Bring in that love that we can come to know through the power of prayer and through these kinds of experiences, and love our fellow beings. Love has infinite power to heal. Unconditional love has no opposing force of darkness and evil. The darkness and evil is simply the absence of that love and light. And each and every one of us can come to know that in our own lives. And what Karen and I try and do in our journey, because we realize you cannot talk and think your way into this. It really comes from first experience. But that doesn't mean you have to wait till you die or almost die to know what it's all about. As a conscious, sentient being, you have all the power necessary. But it just requires that going within, realizing the little voice in my head, that same voice that knows all of that math and physics and all the neuroscience and that discusses all this in rational and logical thought, that little voice is also part of my ego. And that is not the pathway to knowing this. You can set the stage for an understanding through going to these kinds of meetings, to reading the right books, watching the DVDs, but at the end of the day, the only way to come to know it and the truth that we're talking about is by going within. But the good news is any and every one of us can do that. And when you realize that you are not your thoughts, that all those little thoughts in your mind are little more than a parlor trick. So the big magic we're talking about here in terms of a definition of consciousness is to realize consciousness is the observer. And that's what Karen and I often teach in our work and what we'll bring out in our book called Living in a Mindful Universe, which comes out in October, is all about this, realizing that you can develop that observer. The observer is not slave to your ego at all. The observer is the divine part of your consciousness, that when your physical body dies, you will be shocked. That observer becomes far more aware as you reunite with your higher soul and with souls of departed loved ones. Every bit of this, it's the complete opposite of everything I thought before in my materialist scientific thinking, that, you know, when the brain and the body die, then that's the end of conscious awareness. It's just the opposite. It's when we become far more aware. But we can do that through things like meditation and going within and spontaneous epiphanies, after-death communications, all the different modes of being able to realize that this little physical world, even the very time and space of it, is something that is built in on this side of the veil. But there's a much deeper reality, which is our true home, far more real than this world. And that is that world of love and compassion, forgiveness, acceptance, and mercy that we can come to live in our lives here and come to know that eternity of soul, the interconnectedness of all of us, and that the best way to address this life is to love ourselves and love others and embrace it all as the beautiful, miraculous gift that it is. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Eben. Now we're going to ask one more question to Mary, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So start thinking of your questions. But Mary, we talk about this reluctance that people have to believe this sort of thing until they've had their own experience, and that's really powerful. Even Raymond has taken 50 plus years to get there without an experience. And I'm really curious to know, how has this changed your medical practice? Very specifically, how you approach your patients and speak to them about whatever issues they have as a result of your experience. How has that transformed you as a doctor?
Well, I think that it's impossible not to have a profound spiritual experience without being radically changed as a person. I would agree. I mean, Eben, I don't care who it is, you are not the same person. Beforehand, I certainly thought I was a good person. I mean, certainly strove to be ethical with integrity and the whole thing, but when you know that there is life after death, it changes the experience of every moment of every day, and it changes every human interaction. Every single person who's had a near-death experience comes away with the absolute understanding that we are all interconnected, and that in one form or another, love is the only thing that matters. And we all talk about it differently, but the concept is the same. So when I see patients, it's a different experience. Obviously they're coming in with some physical ailment, but I tell people all the time, I would say that 10 or 15% of my practice is their physical problem, and 85% or more is really addressing their spiritual need. And that's sometimes conscious, sometimes not. People feel very comfortable telling me about their own spiritual experiences. If they're scheduled for surgery, I've canceled surgery more than once when I've arrived that morning and they've said, I don't think I'm going to survive. And we talk about it, and there are people who actually, not just because they're nervous about surgery, but because on a very spiritual level, they believe they're not going to come back. And I pay attention to those things, and whether it's in my medical practice or outside, it's going back to this idea of awareness. And I believe personally that every single person can attain that change and can make that transformation to seeing our interconnectedness and actually feeling that love, not only for themselves, but really experiencing love in relationships, even with people you don't know, if you take the time to really look around at the world and look at your own life. I mean, I help patients all the time increase their awareness to God's presence in their life, God's presence in the world. Most of us don't pay attention to it. I certainly didn't beforehand, and I think I'm pretty typical. But I know that one of the concrete ways it's changed my interaction with patients is that I see their maladies very differently. I see a lot of patients who have been injured and their life is radically different. They're either paralyzed or they're not going to be able to return to their previous work activities or recreational activities. They oftentimes lose their marriages, jobs, etc. I mean, these are devastating injuries. And sometimes I will admit I have to feigned concern a little bit because, like Evan, I see all of these things with great gratitude. I mean, my son died, but I would tell you that even on my most sad day, I was absolutely still filled with joy. I know that I signed up for the gig, as did we all. And so when I have patients come in, I help them see their problem, whatever it is, really as an opportunity. It's an opportunity for growth. It's an opportunity for change. And none of us change. I mean, you got to be kidding me. If life is good, why do you ever want to change? Nobody ever, ever, ever changes when things are good. People change when they're up against strife, struggle, challenges. And so those really are opportunities. We all can look back at ourselves from 20 years ago and think, oh my gosh, I'm a way different person than I was then. None of us can imagine how we're going to be in 15 years. But we all know we're going to be different. And we're going to be different because we faced those challenges. And so my whole perception of every moment has changed. And so my interaction with them is different. You know, we don't have to worry about tomorrow. We don't have to worry about what's going to happen half hour from now. It's changed my ability to be absolutely present in this moment, because this moment is really all that matters. The moments that happened in the past, you know, they're gone. I can't change them. But I can change. I don't even know if I can change the future, but I can change right now. And so that has very concretely changed how I experience other people, and specifically patients.
Don't we all want her to operate on our spine?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'd like to open it up for questions. This woman in red, I'm going to repeat your question. So, Dr. Moody, would you please give us the example that I cut you off? Thank you.
Yes. Now,
Great question.
I'm relating this particular event because I was so impressed and touched by the doctor who told it to me. But I've heard this same kind of thing just from lots and lots of physicians who, at the bedside of the dying resuscitated patients. And it's fairly common, I gather, for physicians who treating terminally ill patients will empathically co-live their what we call a near-death experience. So I was in Italy about, I guess, almost 2 years ago. And after my lecture on near-death experiences, an Italian surgeon came up to me, and you could tell from his eyes that I would call him haunted, but not in a negative way. You could tell just from his demeanor that he had been through something that was really transformative to him. So he led me across this auditorium to the corner in the back, and basically what he told me was that some months before, he had been doing an elective surgery. This was not anything pressing or particularly serious, an elective surgery on a fairly young man who was in overall excellent health. So there was no thought that anything untoward would happen during the surgery, but in the event, the man had a cardiac arrest and the doctor was unable to revive him. So he told me that he was just beside himself, you know, like, how did this happen and what am I going to tell the family? Whereupon, and he said that the operating room doors swung open and a woman came in who was, from his point of view, raving, and he assumed she was psychotic. And you know how when you're very stressed out, you have a hard time making out what somebody is saying anyway, right? So he said he had to focus on this lady's face to figure out what it was she was saying, and he figured out she was saying, "My husband is not dead." She said, "I was out in the waiting room and my husband came to me and he said that you think he's dead, so I should come in here and tell you that he's not dead. So the surgeon told me that he was just flabbergasted, and he resumed the resuscitation without even being aware of it. He said he doesn't remember resuming the resuscitation. It just went on automatic. And after a while, lo and behold, the man's heart started beating again. And he said that he was there in the recovery room when the patient regained consciousness, and the first thing that the patient said to him was, "Doctor, I was up there at the ceiling looking at you down there, and I could tell that you thought I was dead. And I kept trying to tell you, I'm not dead, I'm not dead. And so, but you wouldn't hear me, so I went out into the waiting room to see if I could get through to my wife, and I told her to come in here and tell you I'm not dead." And really, I give up. I mean, you know, that's, at a certain point, you just sound ridiculous trying to weave your way out of things like this. I mean, and that's just one case of many that I've heard from physicians who participated in yeah.
Thank you for asking that question. Great story. Yes, back here? Okay, let me repeat the question. I won't repeat all of it, but the gist of it is that why do some patients have experiences and others don't?
I really don't know. Baffled in the same way. I can tell you some factors it's not. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with their prior religious beliefs, if any. Some don't have. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with their age. Doesn't seem to have anything to do with their socioeconomic background. Doesn't seem to have much to do with the specific malady or condition that brought them to the brink of death. And I think there's another factor here, is that a lot of patients will not tell you because they are afraid that they will not be received favorably, and so they keep it private. I noticed that physicians are highly variable in the percentage of patients when they keep track of this, of theirs who have near-death experiences. There were two cardiologists back in the 70s, Dr. Fred Schoonmaker, who was chief of cardiovascular medicine at St. Luke's in Denver, actually, and over in Hamburg, Germany, Dr. Bender, Heinrich, I think, and both of them were cardiologists who had studied this phenomenon. And when I went down to visit with Schoonmaker in 1980, he said that he had resuscitated over 1,600 patients, and he said that about 60% of them have this experience. And Dr. Bender in Hamburg said that it was about 80% of his patients. Now, I will point out that Dr. Bender and Dr. Schoonmaker were both what we call oral personalities. That is, they tend to be rather roundish, they love food, have problems with smoking or drinking, and that their primary orientation in life is service to others, and they tend to be rather laid back. And I can easily imagine if I was trying to picture myself into that situation, that you might respond more openly to somebody who had that kind of affect. And but I don't know. And other studies that have been done in a more systematic way, it's about 20%. But I think another possibility is what's called an event boundary, and that is that it's the experience that we've all had when you. It has to do with the fact that the mind groups things into packets for processing, and that it occurs, for example, when you're in your living room and you decide to go into your kitchen to get something, right? Well, what happens when you go through the door into the kitchen? You forget, right? And I wonder if that's a factor in some of these things.
I'm just going to pipe in on that for just a moment, because I think there are two things about what you're saying that are interesting. One is it doesn't happen to everyone. And I personally think that's fantastic, because to me, that is evidence of their reality. Because if it was just a physiologic process, like, someone breaks their bone, I can tell you the bell curve of what their next 8 weeks are going to be. Everyone goes through it. The fact that not everyone has a near-death experience, I think, again, speaks to the fact that it's not just a physiologic process. The other thing about near-death experiences that I think it's an interesting concept, we were just talking about this yesterday, is it may be that some people remember it, some people don't. Some people remember the details more clearly than others, or more details, because maybe they were sent back for different reasons. Maybe the experience was just to be transformative for them. Maybe it was to show them one part of the experience, the interconnectedness or love or compassion that allows them to then go back to the world and show that. I know that one of the expectations I was given was to write and share this experience, so maybe I remembered more details, because how else would I be able to do that? And so I think that may be one explanation. The real answer, of course, is I don't know. None of us know.
So we want to take more questions. You don't have anything to add, right? I have one thing to add. You mentioned you want to have a shared death experience. There's actually a gentleman who teaches how to do that. He was here last year at the Vail Symposium, William Peters. Okay, Shared Crossing Initiative in Santa Barbara, William Peters. He teaches people. He's getting amazing results. Someone over here had a question?
I guess I question your experience as an NDE.
Why should someone believe my experience, just from a medical standpoint? And one of the things you bring up is a common question, which is, oh, well, it must have been the water temperature. But, well, of course, but what you have to realize is I really, 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 really wanted to disprove my experience. And when you talk about all these things like the water temperature, for example, when you actually go back and look at the studies that was the basis of that myth, you realize it's a myth. It's in kids under 2 years old who fall into a freezing lake and their core temperature drops within a minute. And then even in that, what that means is there's a 30% survival. So you take every single one of those, and I don't have time to go into all of them, but no, I spent a lot of time looking at the physiology of a dying brain and looking at every explanation I could come up with. Oh, it was just a DMT experience. Oh, it was, all sorts of things. And what I discovered as I went through very methodically and very systematically is actually none of the experiences held up. And so at the end of all that, and that was many, many months of research, at the end of all that was when I said, well, okay, I guess I really do have to believe this. And so no, it's a difficult thing. I think that believing that there's life after death is very threatening. And I think that if you accept nothing else other than the fact that our consciousness survives death, I think it's very threatening because it changes the meaning of right now. It changes the importance and meaning of how you spend your time and how you interact with other people. And so, believe me, if I hadn't lived this, I would be sitting where you're sitting thinking, oh yeah, but what about this, what about that, what about that? And again, I don't have time to go into it all, but my challenge every time I speak is that you don't believe what I have to say. Don't believe me. Don't believe Evan. Don't believe any of us. Because I absolutely know that if you go out and you spend the time and effort and have intellectual honesty when you do it, if you spend the time and effort to really look at not my life, not Evan's life, not anyone's life, look at your own life. You look at your own life, and it's always retrospectively. If you look at your life and you line up synchronous events, one or two of those can be coincidental. But when you start to line up the events that led to major changes in your life, your response, what happens after one door closes, when you start to really map out the trajectory of your life, you cannot come to any other conclusion other than the fact that there is a God that is real and present. And so I don't care if anyone believes what I have to say, but more importantly, I want you to try to prove me wrong and prove Evan wrong and prove every one of us wrong, because it's through that process of trying to prove that what we're saying is not correct that you're going to discover your own sense of awareness, and you're going to discover the miracles that occur in your own life.
I love how I love how doctors don't rest. And in fact, in the book that Eben and I wrote, you will get the story of what he went through in the aftermath and how he realized what he experienced couldn't be explained. Here? So
I'm going to answer that because the question is about grief.
Thank you.
And I love my son more than I can imagine loving anything on this earth. He and I were really two peas of the same pod. And I loved him and continue to love him really more than I love anything else on this earth. And I was as devastated as any mother could be, for sure, on a very emotional level. And I still am. But I will tell you that it is an absolute trust in the reality of life after death. And more than that, it is an absolute trust, unshakable trust that there is a God that is real and present, and that really all of God's promises are true. There really is life after death. There really is a God that knows every single one of us, loves every single one of us as though we're the only people on earth. And in addition to that, has a plan for each one of our lives that's one of hope. So when I think about my son, I just went to a funeral last weekend of a dear friend's husband. And it's, on one hand, a terrible thing. But on the other, I experience death very, very differently. And I believe everyone can. It is based on my experience only because my experience transformed what might have been maybe a hope or a faith that, yes, there's kind of more to it, to an absolute trust. And I think that trust is a choice. And I think it's really important that you do the work of looking back at your life and seeing the miracles in your life and seeing God's presence, not just in the world, but in your own life. Not my life, not Evan's. I mean, our stories can be nice fairy tales, a nice children's story, or you can look at your own life and have a transformative experience. And I don't think you have to die. I don't think you even have to have a shared death experience. I don't think you have to do anything but look at your own life. And I think when you make that transformation, that's when everything changes. Because it's when you, if nothing else, if you just accept that consciousness survives, then it leads you down the path of realizing that God is real and present and working. And that's how you deal with grief, because, I mean, we all think about our lives as so long. My grandmother was 104, for heaven's sakes. I mean, that's a long time. But time is like that. Our lives are nothing. They're short, they're quick. We have this little opportunity to get the work done we've come here to do. And then we're back home. I mean, I know that my son will be the first one going, gosh, took you long enough. I mean, you know, when I died, I was greeted by people who have known me and loved me and cheered for me as long as I've existed. And I look forward to seeing my son again and the other people I love who have gone on. But until then, okay, you know, I'm going to get after the work I need to get done. So I think grief is a matter of trust.
Over here in the pink. Good. But be brief with your
Hi,
question,
everybody.
please.
Okay, so my spirit guides who were calling me to them as I was, I was passing away from my body. I knew all of them, like you said, I knew them. But the one who was most outspoken was my Uncle Lawrence, my dad's twin brother who died in World War II. Now, he was there at that time, and I made the conscious decision in my comatose, unconscious situation. I made the conscious decision to live. I saw my parents praying for me, and I've got to go back. Okay, so I came back, but I have had different times when a person will come into my life, and there's this kinship with this person. I was living in Alaska for the last few years. And this guy came into my office, and I knew it was my Uncle Lawrence, okay? I mean, I had this kinship with him, all right? So then, and since then, that was like 5 or 6 years ago, and since then I was down in California, and I'd gone to this tarot card reader, and she told me that my spirit guides were all helping me, and how can they, my question is, if there's reincarnation, if there's if there's life after life, is it just that we're in different planes and we kind of keep going from plane to plane?
I think Eben can speak to that pretty well. Yes?
I'd like to hear that.
So it's,
She's wanting to know about recognizing souls when they show up, when they're supposed to be dead, and how all the interweaving of all the souls works.
well, I think it's because all of this is really about the relationships. None of this matters other than kind of souls and how they interplay and how they learn and teach each other. And one thing that I have become increasingly amazed by over the years is how kind of that side, the other side, the kind of side of the afterlife and of kind of the true home of our souls and all, is exceptionally good at lining up the information and evidence so that we recognize things that we're supposed to recognize to help guide us in our journey. And it really just takes that openness. I think that's what's so important, is to kind of open our minds to the possibility. And as Mary was saying a few minutes ago, trust. It's all about trust. And this is not just about some blind belief in dogma. We're talking about really kind of trusting in your own personal experience. And as I said a little while ago, you don't get there by thinking your way to it. And there's so much of this that is really about that emotion and that connection that we feel. And it's one of the reasons why this is so much a journey, really a journey of the heart. And you can imagine me as this neurosurgeon. I was very struck in my head. even after coming back, trying to explain it all, consciousness, brain, mind. And it was really thanks to Karen who showed me so deeply that this is much more about heart consciousness, and it's a feeling of kind of emotion and connection. And that's where the love is such a crucial part of understanding it all. But I think our souls can have beautiful connections, but it involves that trust to open ourselves to realize the universe is going to give us what we need. And that includes not only who we see when we pass over to welcome us to the other side, but who we can see it in all kinds of kind of visions and dreams in this life to help wake us up to this reality that is much bigger than just the little material world of the here and now.
Another question? Way in the back. Yes, you. So does oneness include the planet and beyond human? Yes? Anyone want to take? I know Evan can answer that. I don't know about the other two.
Well, I would just say that all the confusion, from my point of view, confusion and distortion about understanding of kind of our existence and our role in this universe comes from any kind of false sense of separation. And it's really about everything. And in this modern discussion of consciousness, you'll often find people saying, well, it looks like, given that we know that the brain is not creating consciousness, that maybe consciousness is part of all the particles, that the electrons are conscious and the rocks are conscious and this, that, and the other. I think that's really missing the big point, that it is consciousness itself. It is that kind of mind of God that we are all, to even use the word part of. See, our language conspires against us. But it's really that oneness was the purest and most absolute part of my journey, was realizing all is well, that this world is perfect. And what we see are all these imperfections and the challenges and hurdles in life, but the lessons come bundled with those apparent imperfections. And so much of it is about realizing that we are part of that oneness. And that's what I think is such an important lesson for all of us about this kind of brain-mind discussion and where it's going. Because it really is leading in a direction that postulates one mind. And you can call that God if you want to. But the thing that's so shocking about it, and where it's so different from my kind of religious upbringing, is that is who we are. And in this world, to say, in such an experience, in that oneness that people experience, say in a near-death experience or shared death or any other kind of epiphany, spiritually transformative experience, we have this sense of becoming that love. I mean, when you hear about people's life reviews, you often hear that you experience it from the point of view of the others around you. You don't experience as the person who is the perpetrator of those actions and the subject of the life review. They experience it on behalf of the others. They feel the impact of their actions on others. So much of this is realizing it's those false boundaries of self. I love Jill Bolte Taylor's beautiful book, My Stroke of Insight. In her case, what happened was a very simple vascular malformation right in Wernicke's area, right there where our linguistic center puts together definitions, interrelationships, all of that understanding of how the world works. And as her linguistic center was obliterated, the boundaries started going out. She became the chair. She became the rug, the desk, the room, the trees outside. And it was with this incredible sense of love and oneness that she felt that she was all that is. And in many ways, these experiences show us that the boundaries of self, in many ways, are very misleading. And these kind of experiences are about getting closer to that oneness. And really, in its purest form, it's becoming one with that infinitely powerful God. Now, we're not supposed to say that in our Western culture, and yet that is very much what we're talking about, is that oneness with God, and forget about any kind of sense of separation. So it really is about all the universe, and our mind is one with that universe once we begin to realize this sense of connectedness.
Back there? So the question is, why is that oneness in love so elusive? I kind of think Mary answered that earlier. Maybe you could explain how hardships are the engine for soul growth.
Okay, my voice is going down.
Sorry.
Going down. I think those are two different things.
Okay.
I don't think the challenge is no. I don't think that answers the question. I would absolutely agree with Evan that there's no question that everyone who's had a really powerful spiritual transformation experienced this absolute sense of interconnectedness in one. And I think one of the problems is that we live in a three-dimensional world. And so we have language that reflects our three-dimensionality. We have language to define things. We have, for example, this is a turquoise or whatever. That's not a good example. This is a brown table, and we all know what that means. One of the problems is that we don't have the language to actually describe the interconnectedness. None of us have the language. I don't have the language to be able to actually share that experience with anyone because it's a different experience. And I would say that one of the things, and I could never have the language to really describe it, but when I saw colors, for example, I didn't just see them. I understood them. I experienced them. I could hear them. I could taste them. I could feel them. I understood their very essence. Well, that doesn't make any sense. What do you mean I could understand a color? I mean, it doesn't make sense with our vocabulary. And I think our vocabulary is designed to be divisive in the sense of identifying objects and things, and I think that's really what separates us. And I think in a near-death experience, language goes away. I mean, it's sort of like if you learn a different language. I don't know who speaks a different language, but when you learn how to speak a different language, you start to understand conceptually that language is just a tool to communicate. And you can never translate something word for word because it comes out gibberish. It doesn't actually communicate what you're trying to say. And I think that's fundamentally the problem in our separateness, is because when people do have experiences like these, we can't really communicate it. We can't really communicate the concept.
I'd like to just add this thing about, you can go after me, the love and oneness being elusive. I guess if you're waiting for it to happen, it may be elusive, but it's possible to cultivate it. There's people around the world, and I'm one of them, who cultivated that connection to the love and oneness. I didn't know that's what I was doing at the time, but any kind of meditative practice or any practice of going within on a regular basis, it sometimes seems really boring at first, but when you really put your mind to it and put attention on it, these things can happen. You do not have to just wait, and they do not have to seem elusive. You can cultivate that connection. And Raymond?
Yeah, and you made the point there, Mary, which is exactly right, that the difficulty here is conceptual, and the language we have is not capable of expressing this. And this was pointed out, for example, in William James, who talked about the primary characteristic of a spiritual experience such as this is what he called ineffability. And in fact, that's the most common thing that people with a near-death experience say, is that no matter how articulate they may be, that there are no words. And so I want to say, and again, not to really to raise a question and a challenge more than anything else, but I think I've got that problem solved. I really am. It's at least I sent out my manuscript several years ago to really very brilliant people. I mean, of every just psychology professors, business professors, a logic professor, a physicist, and so on and so on. And all of them, I asked for, tough criticism, and everybody who's read it so far has made the same assessment. I don't know. I gave Eben one a few months ago. He's probably not.
Haven't read it.
Haven't read it.
I'm working on it.
Yeah.
Writing.
Just
But I would
finished
like
up.
to
Writing
know
takes
when-
over. Okay, so yes, right here. Question for Raymond. Question to Raymond. What is the most profound thing he has learned of all the things he's studied?
You know something? I think that it's probably, I've come to see that a big question in philosophical inquiry is what is the nature of personal identity? There have been all kinds of theories like the soul theory, the essence of your person is an immaterial entity, the soul. There's the theory of Locke, for example, that you're made up of your memories. What people say, I was a geriatric psychiatrist before I went into forensics for a little while, and so I began to hear from all of my elderly patients I had plenty of Alzheimer's and such people, but lots of very sharp people who were just there for a situational thing. And so what I constantly heard was that the older you get, the more you become aware that your life is a story, and that the essence of our personal identity is a narrative. It's like each thing that comes new in your life, you add it to your story, right? And Elie Wiesel said, God made man because he loves stories. And I think that's probably correct, that the nature of your self-identity as the person you are is the narrative experience or the story that you go through.
So that's a great place to end. Our time is up, but tomorrow you will have the chance to interact with all of our panelists again from 2 to 5 in the afternoon at the public library. We will be convening again for a longer span. Mary will be telling her entire story, so we look forward to seeing you there. You can still sign up online at the Vail Symposium website, and each of our panelists has a book in the back if you haven't had a chance and you wish to purchase one of those. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Are you doing ayahuasca retreat? Have you heard of ayahuasca?
Yes.
What do you